They built entire cities in months, lit them like daylight at night, hosted millions of visitors, then demolished everything the day after closing. Not some buildings, everything. Palatial structures that looked like marble, intricate domes, elaborate facades, gone within weeks. And the official explanation makes no sense once you examine the numbers, the timelines, the photographs that survive. I started noticing something strange about World's Fairs, not the celebrations themselves, but what happened after. These weren't small exhibitions. The 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition covered 690 acres with nearly 200 buildings. The 1904 St. Louis Fair was even larger, 1,200 acres, over 1,500 buildings connected by 75 miles of roads and walkways. These were functioning cities with infrastructure, power systems, water networks, the full architecture of urban life. Then they were destroyed, systematically, completely, contractually obligated to be demolished. The White City in Chicago attracted 27 million visitors in 6 months. The buildings appeared to be constructed from marble, towering neoclassical structures with columns, arches, ornate details that rivaled anything in Europe. Except they weren't marble. They were made from something called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber. Temporary by design, destined for destruction from the moment construction began. Here's what troubles me. Why build something so elaborate if you're just going to tear it down? The scale of these fairs required massive financial investments, thousands of workers, complex logistics. The 1904 St. Louis Fair hosted 60 countries and 43 states. Nearly 20 million people attended. This wasn't a carnival with tents. This was sophisticated urban infrastructure built to exacting standards, then erased, and the demolition was immediate. In St. Louis, they brought in dynamite crews from Chicago and blew everything up the day the fair ended. By August 1905, only one ticket booth remained standing. Everything else, smoking ruins and debris headed for dump sites. The materials were worthless, we're told. Too temporary to salvage, too cheap to preserve. But look at the photographs. These buildings don't look temporary. They look permanent, substantial, architecturally sophisticated. The level of detail, the precision of the construction, the sheer scale of the endeavor, all of it suggests something built to last. Yet contractually, legally, everything had to come down. The pattern repeats across every major World's Fair. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, San Francisco. Build magnificent structures, host the event, demolish immediately. Even buildings that could have served practical purposes were destroyed. A massive hospital at the Berlin Fair, gone. Theaters, exhibition halls, administrative buildings that cities could have used, all demolished. Sometimes they started tearing things down while the fair was still open. What bothers me most is the timeline. The 1893 Chicago Fair was built during a depression. The 1904 St. Louis Fair happened while America was dealing with significant economic challenges. The 1915 San Francisco Fair came during World War I, yet somehow funding existed to build these temporary cities, then more funding to demolish them completely. The economics don't add up. Construction costs were enormous. Then demolition costs on top of that. You're paying twice, once to build, once to destroy. And the materials, this staff mixture, was apparently so worthless that buildings ended up in dump sites. But if the materials were that cheap and temporary, how did they support the weight of these massive structures? How did they withstand weather, crowds, the stresses of a 6-month exposition? Contemporary accounts describe something else. Visitors were so impressed by the White City that plans emerged to refinish the exteriors in marble or another permanent material. These weren't flimsy carnival structures. They were substantial enough that people wanted to preserve them, fought to preserve them. Architects lobbied to save buildings. Clubs passed resolutions pleading for preservation. Louis Christian Mulgart said about the 1915 San Francisco Fair that demolishing it would destroy one of the greatest architectural units ever created in human history. They demolished it anyway. Within months, sometimes weeks, everything came down. The official explanation, temporary materials, contractual obligations, the need to return the land. But that explanation requires us to ignore the photographs, the eyewitness accounts, the desperate attempts to preserve at least some of these structures. Only a handful of buildings survived, and their survival tells its own story. The Palace of Fine Arts in Chicago was built more sturdily with brick underneath the plaster. It became the Field Museum, then the Museum of Science and Industry. In the 1930s, they recast the facade in limestone to ensure permanence. So the building could be made permanent, the structure was sound, but originally it was slated for destruction like everything else. The pattern suggests something deliberate, not just temporary construction for practical reasons, but enforced destruction. Contractual obligations meant these buildings had to come down regardless of their condition, regardless of public desire to preserve them, regardless of potential civic use. The demolition was more important than the construction, and this happened globally. Every major World's Fair followed the same script. Build elaborate temporary cities, host millions of visitors, demolish everything immediately. The coordination is remarkable. Different countries, different decades, same pattern. As if there were rules everyone agreed to follow, rules that prioritize destruction over preservation. The few exceptions prove how unusual preservation was. The Eiffel Tower was designed as a temporary structure for the 1889 Paris Exposition, meant to stand for only 20 years. It survived because of its use as a radio mast. The Crystal Palace in London survived until it burned, but these are outliers. The overwhelming majority of World's Fair architecture was demolished systematically, thoroughly, within months of closing. So what were they really building? And more importantly, what were they really destroying? I want you to consider something specific about these demolitions. In St. Louis, they brought in dynamite crews from Chicago. The fair ended and they blew everything up the same day. Not weeks later, not after salvaging materials. Immediately. Why the urgency? What required such rapid erasure? Look at the construction timelines. The 1893 Chicago Fair covered 690 acres with nearly 200 buildings, all completed in roughly 2 years. The 1904 St. Louis Exposition was even larger, 1,200 acres, over 1,500 buildings connected by 75 miles of roads and walkways. Built during economic hardship, demolished at additional cost, all within a window that seems physically impossible given the technology we're told was available. The photographs tell a different story than the official narrative. These structures didn't look temporary, they looked permanent, substantial, architecturally sophisticated. The neoclassical facades, the ornate detailing, the sheer scale of engineering required to create artificial lagoons, working water features, electrical systems that illuminated entire cities of buildings. This wasn't carnival architecture. This was advanced construction that happened to be labeled temporary. And here's what bothers me most. The lighting. These fairs were famous for their brilliant illumination, thousands of electric lights creating spectacles that drew millions of visitors. The 1893 Chicago Fair alone used more electricity than the entire city of Chicago at that time. Where did that infrastructure come from? How did temporary buildings support electrical systems of that magnitude? The technical requirements don't match the temporary materials explanation. Consider what happened at the Berlin Fair. They started demolishing the theater while the exposition was still open, not after closing, during, as if the destruction schedule was more important than the event itself. The Brussels Exposition in 1897 saw buildings collapse immediately after the fair ended, described as if they simply fell apart on cue. Does that sound like controlled demolition or structural failure? The before and after maps reveal something crucial. Where these fairs stood, the land use changed dramatically. Forest Park in St. Louis, the Chicago Fairgrounds, the San Francisco Exhibition site, all transformed into something else almost immediately. New development appeared with suspicious speed on land that had just hosted these massive temporary cities. Who owned that land? Who profited from the rapid turnover? Follow the money and you find gaps. These fairs required enormous capital investment. Construction costs, labor, materials, infrastructure, then demolition costs on top of everything else. We're told the materials were worthless, that buildings ended up in dump sites because the staff mixture had no value. But someone paid for the construction, someone paid for the demolition, someone contracted those dynamite crews from Chicago. The contractual obligations are the strangest element. Every building had to be demolished, not could be, had to be. Even when architects lobbied for preservation, even when clubs passed resolutions, even when public sentiment demanded that at least some structures survive, the contracts required total destruction. Who wrote those contracts? Who enforced them? What authority mandated erasure over preservation? Look at what they built in the same era for permanent use. Government buildings, museums, train stations, all using similar neoclassical architecture, similar scale, similar engineering sophistication. Those buildings still stand today, solid and functional after more than a century. But the fair buildings, supposedly made from the same architectural principles, were too temporary to preserve. The distinction seems arbitrary, determined by designation rather than actual structural capability. The Palace of Fine Arts in Chicago proves the point. Built with brick under the plaster, substantial enough to become the Field Museum, then the Museum of Science and Industry. In the 1930s, they recast the facade in limestone, confirming the underlying structure was sound. So why was it originally slated for demolition like everything else? What made this building different except someone's decision to preserve it? The timing aligns too precisely with other patterns we've explored. These major fairs cluster in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the exact period when maps were being redrawn, when architectural styles were being standardized globally, when certain questions about who built what were being quietly shelved. The fairs became showcases of progress, demonstrations that modern nations could build spectacular cities in months. But what if they weren't building? What if they were revealing, then concealing? Think about the visitor experience. Millions of people walked through these spaces, photographed them, wrote about them, marveled at their beauty and sophistication. Then within months, everything vanished. The photographic record shows completed structures, crowds of visitors, functioning cities, then smoke and ruins, then empty land. The transition happened so fast it seems designed to prevent examination, to eliminate evidence before anyone could properly document or question what they'd seen. The global coordination is undeniable. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, San Francisco, Chicago, St. Louis, different countries, different decades, identical pattern, build elaborate temporary cities, host international audiences, demolish completely and immediately. The consistency suggests shared instructions, a common script everyone agreed to follow regardless of local circumstances or public resistance. At the Brussels Fair, buildings collapsed as soon as the event ended. At Berlin, demolition began during the fair. At St. Louis, dynamite crews arrived the day of closing. The urgency seems excessive for simple cleanup. It suggests something else, a need to eliminate these structures before they could be properly studied, before their construction methods could be analyzed, before questions about their true nature could be asked. What were they really building? Or more precisely, what were they really showing? The official narrative says temporary showcase architecture, demonstrations of national achievement, celebrations of progress. But the evidence suggests something more complex, something that required not just construction, but guaranteed destruction, something that millions could witness briefly, but no one could examine closely or preserve for future study. The few buildings that survived did so almost by accident, saved by specific circumstances that made demolition impractical. The rest disappeared as if they'd never existed, leaving only photographs and memories of cities that appeared and vanished like stage sets. But stage sets for what? And who decided the show had to end with total erasure rather than lasting achievement? The buildings are gone, but the photographs remain. The contracts demanded destruction, but they couldn't erase the questions. Why did every nation agree to build magnificent cities only to obliterate them within weeks? What knowledge disappeared in those clouds of plaster dust and dynamite smoke? We're told it was progress, temporary showcases of human achievement. But achievement doesn't require erasure, it invites preservation. These weren't celebrations, they were cover stories for something we're still not supposed to examine too closely.